Hi, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, thank you so very much for being a listener to the Public Relations Review podcast. I would really appreciate your leaving a review of the podcast. Let me know what you think. To make it easy, you can go directly to the podcast website, and that is publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can go directly to the review page to leave your review. So let me know what you think of the podcast. And again, thank you so very, very much for being a listener.
Welcome. This is the Public Relations Review podcast, a worldwide award-winning podcast. Our experienced guests cover a wealth of current, useful topics, including adapting to technological advancements, digital and AI matters, misinformation, media relations, fake news, crisis communications, and much, much more. And of course, your feedback is always welcome. Now, here is your host and producer, Peter Woolfolk.
Now, a question for my audience. Did you know that the mention of crisis theory was not articulated until 1944? Following a fire study that examined the emotional fallout from the deadliest nightclub fire in U.S. history. There, 492 people perished and 166 were injured in Boston on Thanksgiving weekend, 1942. Now, the psychological effects of crisis was also the inspiration for crisis management theory. Our guest today will guide us through the growth and development of communications crisis planning as we know it today. Now, crisis management did not exist as a formal discipline until the late 20th century, after a rash of environmental, organizational, and reputational disasters hit the nightly news, including the Tylenol poisoning and Chernobyl crisis. Early crisis management scholars recognized the immediate need for a framework to predict, plan, respond to, and evaluate crisis events with the goal of mitigating or stopping them through prevention efforts. A jumping-off point was Lindeman's crisis intervention work and others, such as the 1973 Apologia theory. Crisis management pioneers Stephen Fink, Ian Mitroff, and Timothy Coombs laid the foundation for the theory and practice. Fink also wrote his 1986 book, Crisis Management Planning for the Inevitable. So joining me today from Charlottesville, Virginia is Matt Charles. He has a doctorate in public affairs. He's an APR. He's also president of Matt Charles Public Relations and Strategy to talk about crisis communications. Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Peter, thanks for having me.
So look, let's really talk about, let's say right now, for lack of a better way of putting it, the evolution of crisis communications and how we benefit from it today, and other things that you think we should know about that component of public relations.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we know, people have been dealing with crises throughout our entire history. I mean, it's the entire premise for the book, Crisis: A Global History, through Kendall Hunt, my publisher, that just published this past month, where people have always been dealing with it no matter the type, be it an illness, which we've seen again, like recently with COVID. It was bubonic plague in the past, wars throughout our history, natural disasters such as, ancient earthquakes like now, tsunamis, that sort of thing. But it wasn't until pretty much the 1980s where crisis management itself became a formal discipline. Basically what happened, Peter, is with, just crisis after crisis, the nightly news, proliferation of news media, basically corporations were like, hey, we need to do something to address this, so we really need a framework. And fortunately, there were a couple of theorists that came up with frameworks to address crises. The first of which was Stephen Fink, well known as the dean of crisis management. He definitely earned that moniker with his 1986 book, Crisis Management Planning for the Inevitable. And he pretty much came up with a life cycle for crises. And these stages were the prodromal, which is, really identifying a crisis, and it could be a smoldering crisis, one that's lurking, ready to burst out. And then from there is the acute stage, which is when the crisis is occurring and you need to put your crisis plan into action. And then following that is the chronic stage, which within that you can have the initial recovery, still addressing it, of course, and then finally the resolution stage, where, hey, things have calmed down a bit. We have some time to take a breath, but also we need to evaluate like what we've done well and what we could do better. I'm just going to say after him, Ian Mitroff was the next person who really built off of Fink's work. And then in 94, had his 5 phases of crisis management. And the thing he introduced was the fact of like, hey, we're not going to be able to plan. We're not going to be able to prevent every single crisis. So we need to proactively plan for these. Okay, and then following that, Fink and Mitroff, we have Timothy Coombs, who a lot of folks within crisis management know, have read his work, situational crisis communication theory, which is widely applied, across all disciplines. And that's the strength of his theory, but it also really focuses on stakeholder behavior. So really understanding what stakeholders want to see from the organizations, corporations, folks like that, how they want them to behave, what's important to them, and the messaging that they would like to receive.
Let's focus on some of the things like actual, basic, the importance, if you will, and ingredients or components, if you will, of a good, solid crisis communications plan. What are the things that are necessary to have an effective one?
Well, so first of all, you need to have your crisis team in place. And this could be, organizations call them different things, emergency preparedness teams, crisis management teams, folks you're going to bring together when things go badly. You need to have those laid out. And then also you need to identify all the crises. And these could be, anything from taking into account a SWOT analysis to figure out, hey, what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of organization? What could really hit us hard? A bit of a risk management perspective from that as well. Also going through your environmental scanning just to kind of see, hey, what are some threats that could hit us that are hitting some of our peers? And really planning for any and everything. And one thing I like to utilize is the devil's advocate approach, which is basically planning for literally anything and everything. Nothing is too crazy. Nothing is too far off the table. I mean, personally, like crises I've worked, never would have thought there would have been, a white supremacist Nazi uprising in Charlottesville, the University of Virginia in 2017 in the greater Charlottesville area with the Unite the Right rally. But hey, that happened, so you got to have plans in place for literally anything and everything. And with that, you're a way to go about that would be to bring components from your entire organization together, be it the chief executive's office, finance, HR, communications, security and safety, and just say, hey, here are some pressure points that could hit us. Identifying those, having a holistic conversation, and then planning across the entire organization. And once you have the things identified, then you can proactively plan and then figure out what the impact analysis would be, putting maybe a little more emphasis and resources behind crises that could hit your organization more directly. For instance, if you're a restaurant, it could be a food poisoning, planning for that. And then having the response laid out of hey, how are we going to go about actually attacking this crisis should something happen? And that's going to be having your holding statements in place, your ops team ready to be deployed, and knowing what their jobs are. And then finally, you're going to go through your evaluation stage, which is, first of all, you're going to do your crisis monitoring as things are starting to die down, check out maybe what the chatter is on social media, within the media, with your stakeholders. And again, really hitting across all stakeholder groups, be it internal with employees, external with, media community members. And then from that, after that, really evaluating what went well, what didn't, what could we do better. And typically with that, you're going to bring together your team hopefully within 24 to 48 hours to have what's called an after-action report or a hot wash to report out on that.
One of the other things I was thinking about as you're going through that is that, who's involved? One of those things I think is that not only every department, but every person who this might impact, and it might be it might be a shipping department, or it might be some custodians or something along those lines. But everybody who might have something that could go wrong should be at the table in the planning to make sure all the bases are covered.
Yeah, literally anybody and everybody should have a voice. Maybe they can't be in that initial planning meeting, but their bosses or supervisors or those that represent them can bring those to the table. And then, of course, every 6 months to a year, I recommend bringing everybody together to run through an actual crisis scenario If you have the resources, do it twice a year. One can be man-made events such as corporate malfeasance, active shooter, things like that. The other could be natural, such as a tornado, earthquake, act of God event. And with this, you're going to actually have everybody that could be impacted and have them run through scenarios on how to, or run through the scenario on how they're going to address it in real time. You set, basically, the moderator will set it up. Hey, here's what's going on. And then you could have updates throughout to like what's going on with the crisis to really replicate what it would be in that environment so that folks can really get a feel for it. And then, of course, again, you bring everybody back together at the end to go through that hot wash.
One of the things that has happened recently, and maybe this applies to larger organizations, is that some folks will get in there and hold your computers hostage. Maybe banks or other organizations, and hospitals, I think, is another one where they held all their computer information hostage until they paid some ransom. So have you run across any of those sort of things? And how do you protect yourself against that? And if so, what sort of action should you take should that happen to you?
Yeah, so personally, I've had a couple of cyber crisis clients work those. And with that, you're going to be working with law enforcement, be it state, federal, sometimes international, to try to locate the culprit. You really, if you can not, you don't want to pay the ransom because that just opens it up, and that's just giving into extortion while you're tracking people down. And through that, there's basically going to be two components. One is the management side of really kind of going through with your team and your law enforcement partners of figuring out who did it, and with that also protecting all other data to make things that are shut down. Then you have your communications component, where you're communicating out to your stakeholders, those that were affected, if there was any personally identifiable information released, steps that are going to take place to address that, solutions, remediations. And you could also, I recommend having an FAQ or a frequently asked questions page for folks to refer to, and also some sort of website or some sort of page on your website that's a repository of information with updates on that. And that's actually one of the 9 types of crises that I identify in the book, one being technological, which, we're seeing this a lot now. You bring it up with cybercrime as far as, ransoms. We also see it with elections, disinformation, misinformation campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this isn't a new thing, Peter. I mean, even in the late 1850s, there was the Hawthorne incident, which was basically a solar flare that wrecked telegraph communications across wide part of the world over what would have been basically the Labor Day weekend, September 1st or 3rd. They had Labor Day back then, just shutting down global comms because folks weren't aware at that point that a solar flare could do that. But that was a technological crisis at the time.
It comes to mind now simply because everybody is talking about AI. How can AI be used in, let's say, maybe the prevention of crisis communication, or better still, how can it be used in whatever format is used in to help prevent and minimize crisis communication?
Well, I think first, if you're going to use it, you have to make sure that it's speaking the same language you are and kind of thinking along the same lines algorithmically. And you're going to use that, you can use it generatively to help formulate ideas, try to come up with scenarios, really quickly, maybe write out some sort of crisis communication or statement or with the facts that you have. This really can help you real time in a lot of the tactical aspects, but you're still going to need the human side to think strategically. So you could ideate through the AI as well, that you have whichever tools you choose to use. Now, on the flip side of that, we also need to realize that AI can be weaponized on the other end.
Mm-hmm.
You need to be able to prepare for that and say, hey, what are some scenarios that could hit us? Specifically, it's a lot. We're seeing it more through the disinformation and misinformation, and just things being just splattered out there across the internet ether, with just basically false claims that are going to basically incite people, turn folks against one another, and it's a whole mess at that point.
Would you recommend, because I forget the exact title of them now, but there are a lot of programs that you can use online to find out people's sentiment about you. What are they thinking about you? Or, if there are things being said that could lead to some sort of crisis. Would you recommend having those, I forget the names of those particular programs to have so that you're up to speed on what's being said about you, regardless of what it is, positive or negative?
Yeah, I mean, there's some social media consultancies that basically have their proprietary software that you can work with them. But, you could also just I find that the good old Google search, and I've had conversations with folks about this, if you really need something in real time, that's really going to help you figure out what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Now,
and really, but it's also, and this is where you could use AI, would be to figure out what those keywords are going to be to help generate like the best information for you. Or help make sure at least you're asking the right questions.
Now, one of the things we always advise people to do is to back up their work. Is that a prevention process as well? Because I don't know whether you do it on an hourly basis or weekly or however that's done, but would you recommend that being done as a way to salvage anything that might come down as a hostage situation? Yeah,
I mean, you always want to be. I mean, of course, now everything's in the cloud. It could be secured that way. Just make sure whatever company you're working with is reputable, and they have their plan in place should something happen. Because at that point, I mean, they would probably be the ones that are liable. Make sure you're insured. But also just really keep an eye on anything you do back up, even if you put it on a thumb drive. Don't use public access computers. Don't use your friend's computer. Be careful. Don't leave your cell phone out. Make sure you're using encrypted software. Yeah, you'd really just want to play it safe and not be reckless at all, because it could definitely come back to haunt you. So basically, nothing that's going to let out any information that you don't want out there.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about several things that have happened in public relations. That an example of crisis communications and how two organizations did it in a different way. One, the Cracker Barrel incident, and then, of course, Red Lobster. Let's talk about, let's say maybe, let's take Cracker Barrel first, because that's the latest one that they made some changes and to both the logo and so forth, and that didn't go over very well.
No, so Peter, these would fall into the category that I call organizational reputational crises. And so you have two different versions, even though both look like they were going the wrong way at first, but Red Lobster salvaged theirs. Cracker Barrel, what happened with them was, and look, I wasn't part of their discovery process or any sort of stakeholder research, so I don't know. But, be it their agency of record or the group themselves, you really need to figure out what the stakeholder, what it is they want. Mm-hmm. And again, this goes back to Coombs' situational crisis communication theory. Had they understood that the Cracker Barrel brand as is resonated so well or so much with most stakeholders, probably wouldn't have touched it. Or if they had, maybe would have kept the basic tenets of it, and beta tested it and put it out there. Mm-hmm. So basically, you just want to make sure you're not using your own ideas, echo chamber, and not really working with those that are really buy into the brand. Because as we see with stakeholders, I mean, it's become where they have a lot of power. I mean, we saw how many hundreds of millions of dollars, or tens of billions of dollars, lost in market share within one day from that brand change. And you and I mean, you're in Nashville, I'm in Charlottesville. I grew up in Southside Virginia. Plenty of Cracker Barrels around. I think you and I both could have predicted that was not going to go well. And that's just guessing. Because folks really, identified with the founder sitting by the barrel. Well,
and that's what I was about to say. There were two components of it. Their logo seemed to be the one that caught all the hell. Maybe updating the interior a little bit. Folks weren't squeamish about that, but leaving that guy up leaning on the barrel is where wheels came off. And
that's what put it over the edge.
That's right.
Yeah, that was. I mean, you're watching it in real time. I mean, that definitely was. There were vehement comment. I mean, people feel very strongly about that.
Mm-hmm. And then the other side, Red Lobster. Of course, that unlimited shrimp thing. Well, obviously the customers loved that very well, but the outcome wasn't what the company expected. And then how they went about correcting it.
Yeah, so they basically understand operationally, hey, supply chain issue, and then they basically embrace their brand and their people. Going back in the summer and have done very well, Mm-hmm. Really just sticking with who they are is as a brand and as Red Lobster, not really changing things too much. And similarly, when you really embrace and acknowledge what happened, I mean, we've seen it again with KFC, where the supply chain issue in the UK where not enough chicken. How can KFC not have enough chicken? And I think that's a pretty fair question to ask when you go there, right?
All right.
And they were like, hey, supply chain, we messed up. I think there was also a major wreck bringing chicken in. So they had hours where they couldn't get it in through this major thoroughfare.
Mm-hmm.
And next thing you know, Colonel Sanders is helming the socials, bringing that brand character back in, being self-deferential, poking fun of themselves. You have the old, instead of KFC, FCK, no chicken, they're really just poking fun of themselves and did a really great job. And I would argue reputationally came out stronger for it.
Well, that's what I was going to say about Red Lobster. Yes, they acknowledged that they screwed up, made a mistake and laughed at themselves and oops, sorry about that. We won't have that again. How could we have been so foolish not to anticipate that sort of thing? And, folks like the fact that, we acknowledged the mistake and we're going to try to do better the next time.
Exactly. And I mean, again, with crisis, management and crisis, specifically crisis communications, that is the magic formula. Stating what happened, being truthful about it, and as open as possible, transparent as possible, and then the solutions that you're going to take to rectify it, and then providing updates as you go along. And if it's something really tragic, like a death, or just in general, if somebody is really hurt, or a group is really hurt, or having a hard time, really infusing everything in empathy.
One of the things that you've alluded to, or sort of mentioned briefly in our conversation today, is before we leave, I want you to just give our listeners an overview of the book that you've recently published.
Yeah, so the framework itself we've discussed a lot, during our initial conversation here, of basically going about how to work through crises and the frameworks, basically that have been identified and the ones that I use. The book itself, what differentiates it, Peter, is it's an historical narrative and going back and examining 9 different crisis types throughout history. Each crisis type is a chapter. Most of them are starting in prehistoric times, and how people dealt with them. Did it go right? Did it go wrong? If it went wrong, why? And just we see over and over again, a lot of this is mistakes in leadership. And it really does boil down to leadership. And if people are willing to make decisions that might be tough at the time, but are for the greater good, or if they want to back off because they're too worried about their own legacy, that's another issue. But the 9 different types, the first one is conflict or crisis. The second is disease. Then we go into economic, environmental, famine, natural, organizational, reputational, social justice, and technological. And I differentiate between environmental and natural. Natural would be purely act of God, again, an earthquake. Whereas environmental could be something such as, carbon in the atmosphere that may cause a weather event, but basically it's something that we've caused as humans, as people. And also, interestingly enough, analyzing a lot of these crises, if one happens, it puts you at risk, much higher risk for another type of crisis jumping in. So, for example, if there is a war, you're definitely at risk for famine. And we've seen that, World War I is a great example, with millions of people starving to death. Interestingly enough, talking about leadership, Herbert Hoover, who many would, maybe state maybe one of our least popular presidents ever because of his performance Depression era, leading into that before FDR took over. Prior to that role, he was head of helping basically make sure there were supply lines of food into Europe so people were fed. So this guy, from an organizational supply chain perspective, he's a former engineering, mining executive. Great job. One of the greatest humanitarians of all time, widely known from that angle as far as helping prevent famine. But then once you get into political leadership, that's a whole different ballgame where you're leaning on other people to get things done and you can't micromanage as much. And you might not totally understand the entire concept or philosophy of what's going on economically. It's much more of a micro versus the even though the hunger of helping solve that was was a macro deal. At least micro, you could figure out and chart supply lines and supply chains. And even coming out of his presidency, after World War II and during it, he was brought back in to help make sure folks in Europe had enough food because people did realize how good he was at that. And it just came down to types of leadership that he had and situations he was in. One he performed awesome, the other not so much.
Okay. Just one more thing before we go, because when it comes to public relations and you look at people's websites and so forth, a lot of people say that we have crisis communications experience. Give me your idea of what people should look for from someone who advocates that they are a good crisis communications specialist for PR.
Yeah, I would say experience, number one. Yeah, it's great to have the training as far as, degrees, certifications, like we all know. The accreditation for public relations through PRSA, or the Public Relations Society of America, Gold Star. And that one you have to go through a little bit more training, so definitely the experience plays in there. But I would say experience, knowing the sector is huge. But, if somebody has really good or very solid crisis management, crisis communication experience in one sector, that is also pretty easily transferable to other sectors if it's a similar type of problem.
Okay.
But, yeah, experience is a big thing.
Well, Matt, once again, you've come through and you've delivered some solid information that our listeners can really, really appreciate. And I want to thank you again for being a guest on the Public Relations Review podcast.
Hey, Peter, I appreciate it. It's good to be back on, man. We haven't done this in a few years.
Well, I'll certainly keep you in mind, because right now, believe it or not, the podcast has grown to such a point now that I'm actually getting swamped with requests for people to come on the podcast. So I'm I have to read it very carefully to find out, one, what is it they want to talk about, and two, have we done it before, and three, what experiences I have in it. So it's growing, as I might have mentioned.
It was great working with you back in 2019 when you first started. It's great to see how this has grown.
Well, I appreciate it, and once again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Peter. I appreciate it.
This podcast is produced by Communication Strategies, an award-winning public relations and public affairs firm headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee. Thank you for joining us.
Hello, this is Peter Woolfolk. First, let me say thank you so much for being a listener. Now, I want to alert you to our shiny new podcast website located at podpage.com. However, you can go directly to the podcast site located at publicrelationsreviewpodcast.com. There, you can contact me through email. You can leave a voice message. You can leave a review. You can read an episode blog and frequently learn about the podcast guests. You might also want to suggest podcast topic ideas or even suggest a guest. You can also let me know if you would like to receive our podcast listener logo that you can post on your social media. So I look forward to hearing from you about our new podcast website. Thank you so much for listening to the Public Relations Review podcast, and have a great day.